Many debates around foreign policy play themselves out between people who hold either a realist or idealist perspective on how the world works. For the realist, the world is a jungle. For the idealist, it's a jungle that could be turned into a garden. Here's another distinction to consider. A realist walks into a bar, orders a half-empty glass of vodka. The idealist, on the other hand, would walk into the same bar and order a half-full glass of vodka. To help us figure out the differing perspectives, we welcome, in Tel Aviv, Israel, via Skype, Janice Stein, founding director of the Munk School of Global Affairs and TVO's foreign affairs analyst, and in Columbus, Ohio, Randall Schweller, professor of political science at The Ohio State University, and we are happy to welcome both of you. Janice, you're a long way away. It's nice to have you on the line, though.
Sure am.
Let's start with this. Cards on the table, everybody. Janice, when you go into that bar, are you ordering a half-empty or a half-full cup of vodka?
I'm probably ordering the half-full cup, Steve, but that's really a difference between an optimist and a pessimist, not quite the difference between a realist and an idealist.
So you're not going to play with our little metaphor here. All right, fine. Randall, how about you? Are you ordering the half-empty or the half-full glass of vodka?
Definitely the half-empty glass of vodka. I do think realism at its core is a pessimistic perspective on international politics. It's about how we live in a nasty, brutish world, and the best we can do is try to be less nasty than our opponents. And these are kind of the enduring realities of international politics, that morality and justice are things that we do in our individual life, but international politics is too serious a business.
Let's play a clip, if you don't mind, from the preceding interview we just did with Professor Neil Ferguson about, essentially about the subtitle of his new book on Henry Kissinger. Roll it, please, Sheldon.
I thought I was going to write the first volume with a subtitle like American Machiavelli. That was my working title when I set to work. But once I began to read through the material, I was struck by the fact that he was anything but a realist. In fact, that caricature of Kissinger as not just the arch realist, but Dr. Evil, a caricature that my countryman Christopher Hitchens did much to create, certainly falls apart in this first half of his life, because on at least 3 counts, he's far more an idealist. I mean, number one, his experience in the 1930s and 1940s certainly made him wary of foreign policy realism in that sense, because for him, the appeasers who had appeased the dictators in the 1930s had been failed realists. He said in a memorable interview in 1957, the appeasers thought of themselves as tough realists. That was not intended as a compliment. And then there's this philosophical side to Kissinger that's so important. At Harvard, he immersed himself in the philosophy of Immanuel Kant and idealism as a school of philosophy. And finally, and I think this is a really key part of the argument, for Kissinger, the Cold War was not just a struggle between economic systems, it was a struggle between totalitarianism and the idea of freedom. So I show that in the first half of his life, he really was the idealist. The second volume will unquestionably have a different subtitle.
Janice, let's pick up on where he ended off there, and namely the Cold War. Do you think that was fought on idealistic or realistic grounds?
Well, you know, that's what's so interesting, Steve. It's a mixture of the two. I mean, Neil Ferguson has, I think, an important point here. We tend to think of Henry Kissinger as the arch realist, and there is certainly a great deal that he says later in his life that suggests that that's indeed what he is. But he's also an idealist at the same time, because he's motivated by a fight against what he considers evil. And he represents the forces, he's mobilizing the forces of good against the forces of evil. That's an idealist perspective. And if you listen to a lot of the rhetoric during the Cold War, John F. Kennedy, who calls his countrymen to this great overpowering struggle of good against evil, that's the Cold War from an idealist perspective, not a realist perspective.
Randall, let me get your take in as much as, do you believe that democracy promotion by the West works?
Oh no, it definitely does not work. Doesn't mean that we don't like democracy, but we tend to like democracy when it supports American Western values and interests. We don't like democracy when it does doesn't do those things. And we've shown throughout the years through disastrous wars that we've fought that you can't export democracy. You can't change people's minds through guns and the military. So.
Well, certainly, let me jump in here. Certainly, recent history in the Middle East would suggest that you're right, but let's go further back. Let's go back to the 1990s, the 1980s, when the Iron Curtain fell down. Didn't America, in some respects, influence and export democracy to Eastern Europe?
Yes, it's certainly to some extent, but what you're seeing is a realist would say that American power at the end of the Cold War was unchecked power. And unchecked power, no matter how benign its exercise, is capriciously exercised and a danger to everyone else in the system. And democracy promotion, which has always been one of the capstones of American foreign policy, was clearly a milieu goal, a non-security goal. The U.S. promoted the expansion of NATO. And what we've seen recently with Russia and Ukraine is how this has come back to bite us, not to mention Russia and Georgia. You can't expand and promote democracy right up to the door of the Russians and think that this great power is not going to be apoplectic about it because it's their sphere of influence. So you have to understand as a realist what's prudent, not just what you want to do. You would like to make the world, the coup, for example, in Ukraine, we may have supported what they were saying, but we were not empathetic to the vital strategic interests, which were Russia's strategic interests. And just to put this in context, since we've mentioned the Cold War, think of how apoplectic the US got when the Russians put missiles in Cuba. So,
back in 1960, yes, indeed. Okay, Janice, well, let me try this with Cuban Missile Crisis, 62. Thank you. Janice, how about this? Idealism versus realism. I understand your position that you think we need a dose of both to operate in the world today, but in the main, would you say one is more required than the other to make progress?
I really do think you need a dose of both. You know, idealism is this normative call to do good in the world. And Randy, that's undoubtedly such a strong strand in American foreign policy. But if it's not prudent, if it's not careful, if it's not laced with the pragmatic, it's going to overreach. And that's the important contribution, really, that realism makes to the understanding of foreign policy. So really the great idealists are the ones that lead states into wars that, as Randy just said, can be a terrible overextension of power, and it leads to retreat, retrenchment, chaos. But if you're only a realist, if you're only about the balance of power, you, in a sense, leave your own citizens dissatisfied, unmotivated, cynical, and ultimately in a democracy, you often lose power. So you need both.
Janice, let me follow up with this. I guess realists would say of idealists that they like a world that sort of works in an interdependent way because they believe that ultimately that is the path to peace. Do you plead guilty to that?
Well, certainly what idealists believe. They believe that the world is nasty, brutish, and short, but they do believe that if you build institutions, better institutions, you can escape at least partly some of the traps. And I think probably, although not fully in that, I won't go all the way with that because there are limits to international institutions. There are important ways of checking power. So let's take the United States again for an example. Even under realist leaders, they often go to the United Nations and to the United Nations Security Council to authorize the use of force. Now, not always, but often. Why do they do that? That has nothing to do with the underlying balance of military power and everything to do with legitimacy in the international system. That's an idealist concept.
Okay, let me preface this next question to you, Randall, by reading an excerpt of your book. This is from Maxwell's Demon and the Golden Apples. The world is undergoing transformation. We are entering the age of entropy, a chaotic period where most anything can happen and little can be predicted, where yesterday's rule takers become tomorrow's rule makers, but no one follows rules anymore, where competing global visions collide with each other, where remnants of the past, present, and future coexist simultaneously. In this world, Global interdependence is increasing, power is diffusing, and multilateral cooperation is dwindling. Capabilities to block, disable, damage, and destroy prevail over those to adopt, enable, repair, and build, where a geography no longer distinguishes friends from enemies and no one can be trusted. My goodness, Randall, that's a very, very bleak look at the world, but let's start with this. Your statement that,
So
quote,
I've been told.
your statement that interdependence is increasing. Okay, how do you square that with suspicions that I suspect you have about organizations such as the European Union and NATO, international trade agreements? You know, you may want it one way, but the world looks like it's coming together in another way. Would you agree?
No. I stick to my guns. Globalization is clearly a force, and it's a force for what I think is an ungovernable world. It's got good points to it, but it's not a panacea. It's not going to create a natural harmony of interests among nations. And this is a very big difference between idealists and realists, is that realists don't believe there's a harmony of interest among states. So the EU, NATO, these are remnants from the past. We've recently seen that. NATO, its days are not numbered, but I still believe its years are. And the Ukrainian crisis shows, I think, to some extent, and the way we've been behaving recently, that the ties are fraying. And NATO is not a useful institution the way it was when there was a Cold War to be fought. There is no Cold War anymore. And this is an interesting point about these institutions, is that America created these institutions, and that you have to understand that they project American power. The idealists tend to think of international institutions as promoting international interests, whereas realists see these international institutions as created by the strongest of the strong powers to further their national interests, not some international interest.
Janice, how do you see it, those international organizations?
Well, the international institutions really can serve an important role of checking or restraining national power. In that sense, they're a brake on an unbridled realist world. The presence of international institutions doesn't necessarily mean that we are, on a march toward an interdependent world that will be peaceful and that there's a harmony of interests. That's, I think, almost a stereotype of an idealist world. But what it does suggest, that in this world that Randall described, where and we're at a very interesting moment, Steve, because I can agree with Randall that we're at a moment when the old world order is really collapsing. If you look at the part of the world that I'm in right now, the Middle East, the old state-based order is crumbling in parts of this world, and we see the violence that is personal in many parts of it. But that doesn't mean that the realists are correct here. The consequences of what is really a brutal struggle of all against all, as Hobbes would say it, is a search for new instruments, new institutions that can put some brakes on a struggle that is increasingly brutal and violent.
Let me follow up with Randall on one angle that you brought up there, and that is, are you being a little bit too cynical, Randall, when you say these international institutions are all about projecting American power as opposed to sort of guaranteeing an international order of liberal democracy?
Well, they don't guarantee a liberal international order. They support a liberal international order. I totally agree with that. That's why the U.S. promoted it. I also agree that this has been an order that the United States pretty much created after 1945 that has helped everyone in the world. All boats have risen. It's been the most prosperous 75 years in the history of the world, and America has always done well by recognizing that to do well for itself, it has to do well for others, and it created an order where it is a legitimate order. The most efficient way to exercise power is to do it legitimately, to have others believe it's in their interest to do what you want them to do.
Okay, let me follow up with this then, Randall.
That.
Let me follow up
Yes.
with, I want your take on Putin. You as a realist, I want you, because I like this quote of yours, you say, I feel bad for Ukrainians, but I want to live a quiet life, meaning I don't want to look for trouble with Putin. So what does a realist make of what Putin's up to?
Oh, I think Putin's, let's take Ukraine. I think that was, and here I agree with Henry Kissinger, who I would go back and argue was a realist. I think Neil Ferguson is quite wrong about what he said, and it's a very selective reading of Kissinger, maybe prior to 1968 as he's talking, but clearly after 1968 he was very realist. Putin, what the Americans did, as I said, expanding NATO to Russia's border was a reckless overextension on our part. And Putin is just acting like any realist with a sphere of influence, saying, this is my strategic interest, not yours, and I'll have higher resolve than you will to fight for it. And we saw that. Now imagine, this is in response to a declaration, a Bucharest declaration, where we said that eventually Georgia and Ukraine would be in NATO. Why would we extend an Article 5 guarantee to Ukraine when we've already shown that we will not fight for Ukraine? So at least when it comes to the Ukrainian issue, I think Putin was acting prudently and in exactly the way a realist would expect the leader of a great power to respond. Now what he's doing in Syria, I think he's winging it. I think he is doing anything to poke America in the eye. And in the end, we should be saying, great, go right ahead. You like quagmires. The best way, if you want to get rid of Putin or you want to bring Russia down, let them get involved in Syria. Let them fight ISIS. Why would we want to fight ISIS?
And conversely, Janice, I wonder whether the United Nations did not stop, the lack of a United Nations good housekeeping seal of approval didn't stop George W. Bush from making a decision to go into Iraq. It certainly didn't back in 1994 prevent a massacre in Rwanda. Does the sometimes quite apparent impotence of the United Nations not make idealism occasionally, Janice, a very tough sell?
It certainly does, Steve. And the United Nations Security Council, I think, is best known for its dysfunction, and it continues. As the years go by, if you look at what it has not done in Syria to cement its reputation for dysfunctionality. But the United Nations is only one of a thick network of international institutions. The same is actually not true for NATO. The same is not true for some of the economic institutions, where really even the United States binds itself to rules in advance for one of the reasons that Randy just mentioned, that the United States does well when other powers do well as well, and therefore there is a strong interest that the United States has in creating a liberal international order.
Yeah,
now,
but you know what, Janice? Janice, you know what, though? You're a Canadian. And of course, a Canadian, as a middle power in the world, thinks it's wonderful when all of the powers of the world are getting together nicely and making decisions collectively. Randall, as a guy who, well, but Randall is an American who's number one. You know, he doesn't need that, right? He can afford to go alone. They're number one.
He actually does, because it's much better for the United States. The United States prospers. The United States spends less on military expeditions when there is a liberal international order. The United States will constrain itself to some degree so that everybody does well. And when everybody does well, the United States does best of all. That's not a pure anarchic realist world.
Let me make a quick point, because I listened to your debate, their prime minister debate on foreign policy. It was incredibly impressive, given they were so articulate and so
in
much
two
more
languages.
articulate than,
Jealous, Randall?
right, in two languages than our candidates have been. But what really struck me was how other regarding they were speaking about the Canadian national interest, as if that the Canadian national interest was somehow the equivalent of the international interest or the community interest. Whereas I want to make this point that I think American leaders are, for the last 7 years, have been far more liberal internationalists, far more idealists, and that includes the neocons, the neoconservatives, who think promoting democracy should be at the center of American foreign policy, far more extroverted than the American public, which I think the American public is very realist. When you look at the polls that have been conducted, opinion polls and surveys, they think that American power should serve American interests narrowly defined, that if there are going to be other goals involved, if we do get in, that's when we get in multilaterally. It's not because we care about the legitimacy. We just want to share the burdens of things that we don't feel are in our national interest narrowly defined. So Americans have always had this exceptionalist view that we don't care about the rest of the world. We're not interested in humanitarian concerns. It's not that we're bad people, but we don't talk about, the American people do not think of foreign policy as social work.
Okay, in our last minute here, forgive me for jumping in, we're literally down to our last minute here, and I want a brief answer from both of you because the presidential season in the United States is upon us, and I'd like to know from each of you which candidate of either party currently running, in your view, combines the best realistic and idealistic approach to making foreign policy in this world work. Randall, you want to go first?
I think Rand Paul would be the best candidate if you're a realist because he believes in offshore balancing, which actually Obama has been doing, trying to do, but the foreign policy establishment won't let him. They will not let him, for example, in the Middle East, pursue an offshore balancing strategy where you let the regional powers do most of the heavy lifting. So they claim that ISIS is an existential threat to the United States, which it clearly isn't. ISIS is an existential threat to itself because it's surrounded by enemies. It's just completely surrounded by enemies.
Okay.
And we should let them take care of the problem. So I'd say a minimalist foreign policy, one probably Rand Paul would have if he was a viable candidate.
Well, he's still running, so he's at the moment a viable candidate. Janice, how about for you?
Tough to choose, Steve, and partly for the reason that Randall just mentioned. We're in the middle of election madness in the United States. The American public is more isolationist than its foreign policy elites. So what you're hearing from the presidential candidates is really not representative of what any one of them would do were they in office. Any one of them would be far more idealist than their present position suggests they would be.
Understood. Janice Stein, Randall Schweller, it's good of you to join us on TVO tonight. Thanks so much.
You're so
Thanks for
welcome.
having me.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit supporttvo.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.